one-upmanship on how cruel you can be to people seeking asylum in our country. This has not only shamed Australia domestically, but it's shaming us internationally, and it's leading to other leaders in our region saying that it will destabilise other countries in the region. There is another way. What has happened is that deterrence has not worked. Just as the Greens said last year it would not work, the policy of cruelty and punitive action offshore detention has led to 4 times the number of people trying to come to Australia by boat and risking their lives at sea, and the tragedies we've seen with lives lost. So since deterrence hasn't worked, why don't we do what we know is the right thing to do? Why don't we appeal to the best that's in Australians? Why don't we do what's been proven to work previously, and that's seriously engage with the region and the rest of the world in a program that helps refugees? And that's why the Australian Greens are saying today we will increase our humanitarian intake to 30,000 people a year. We will take immediately of that 30,000, 10,000 in the region, so as to reduce the backlog of people waiting to be found permanent resettlement. We want to also double the amount of money we're spending by putting another 70 million a year into assisting the UNHCR in Indonesia to be able to assess and move people through the system faster and more safely. This is a key to saying to people who are desperately waiting for resettlement in the region, you have another option. You don't have to go on boat journeys to Australia. You now are being offered a safer pathway. It's saying to the other countries in the region, Australia is serious about finding a regional way to deal with these issues, and it's saying to the rest of the world, Australia is prepared to open up its heart to refugees, expand the numbers we take, and in that context ask the rest of the world to help us deal with the issue of people moving around the planet because they're driven from places because of persecution and repression. It's about humanity, it's about compassion. But even if you look at the cost of this, what the Coalition and the government are doing is not only hideously cruel and expensive in terms of the toll on human lives and health and happiness into the future, it's a very expensive policy in dollar terms. The Greens have had the Parliamentary Budget Office look at the cost of increasing our intake, humanitarian intake, to 30,000, and it would be $2.5 billion over the forward estimates. In contrast, the government intends to spend $7.2 billion on its cruel offshore detention centres and punitive action, and that's not even including its latest efforts to expand the Gulag on Manus Island. And then today we've had the Coalition not only announcing its tent city and slums policy in Nauru, but saying that it expects it to cost another $50 million, refusing to say where that money is going to come from, whether it's every year, and I challenge the Coalition to put its policy to the Parliamentary Budget Office for costings. Ours, the Greens program, is about compassion, a fair go and leadership. And I'm calling on both the Prime Minister, Mr Rudd, and Tony Abbott to drop this vilification, marginalisation of refugees, this awful talk of trying to turn it into cruelty and border protection, and instead put the welfare and long-term well-being of people seeking asylum at the heart of our policies. But there's a lot of additional detail. Sarah.
Thanks, Christine. So firstly, what this policy is basing itself on is what worked after the Vietnam War. And the Greens have spent a long time speaking to experts and those involved with how the resettlement program worked after the end of the Vietnam War, where Australia took that leadership. We had genuine leadership in the region for a genuine regional approach. Australia funded the assessment of people's claims in Indonesia and Malaysia. We committed to taking people, and with that commitment came the willingness of other countries to resettle people as well. That is precisely the crux of this policy. We've got to be giving people a safer option than having to be forced into the hands of people smugglers. The government and the opposition's policy is all about punishing vulnerable refugees once they've already boarded a boat, making them suffer because that was the only option available to them. This policy is based on what has worked in the past and also what the Houston panel recommended Australia do immediately 12 months ago. The Houston panel said that we needed to take 3,800 people from our region. The government failed to do that. If we had taken 3,800 people from our region, there wouldn't have been so many people today coming on boats. The other part of this policy is to ensure that we deal with the backlog in relation to family reunion. The government has put a ban on family reunion. That is why, tragically, we're seeing more women and children come to Australia by boat than ever before. We need to allow families to be reunited safely, ensuring that we look after them and give them a fair go. Lifting the ban on family reunion would mean that mothers and children would not have to be forced onto boats in order to be reunited with their fathers, their husbands and their brothers. It is a fundamental part of having a humanitarian and a humane solution to make sure families can stay together, not keep them separated. Of course, there is the issues in relation to the gulags on Manus Island and the slum solution as announced by the opposition. And the Greens' policy is to shut down those detention camps because they are not doing anything to deter people. All they're doing is inflicting more pain and suffering. And I think there's a lot of people around the country today who'll be quite sad to know that the government is storming ahead with their cruel plan to dump refugees on Manus Island as early as today. The idea that Manus Island is an appropriate response from a country that is rich in our region, not just rich in resource, but should be rich in heart, is absolutely appalling to many Australians. The policies presented in this race to the bottom between Tony Abbott and Kevin Rudd is an attack on Australia's generous heart. Many people around this country, and the poll released by the Greens today shows many Australians feel ashamed that our government and our opposition are more concerned at competing in an arms race to cruelty rather than giving refugees in our region a fair go. It is an attack on our generous heart, and it is smashing our international reputation. It's got nothing to do with stopping the people smugglers.
Are you certain that these measures alone are going to be enough to stop people getting on boats?
Well, firstly, I think what it does is say to people who are waiting for resettlement in the region, waiting for assessment for their refugee claims, that there is now a safe pathway, and that if they wait and go through those processes, they can avoid the dangers of getting on boats and risking this journey. But it also requires the other measures. The family reunion measures, for example, are critical to stop women and children getting on boats. I think what needs to be seen, though, is what it will send to the rest of the world and to the region and to people who are waiting, is that there is a genuine effort underway from Australia to increase the number we take, work with our regional neighbours and help the people who are waiting. What they get at the moment is a message from Australia that you're not going to get any help to get to this country, therefore you've got no option but to get on a boat. What they're actually doing at the moment is reinforcing people's fears that they'll never get resettlement and therefore they'll take risks. We want to stop people feeling as if they have no option. We want to save the lives of women and children and families and people seeking refuge. This really goes to the heart of the question, what is the point of the policy? Is the point of the policy to help refugees, to give them confidence that there is a safer pathway and that they don't have to take risks? Or is the point of the policy simply to say, out of sight, out of mind, let's outsource this problem, let's get rid of it in the run-up to an election? Therein lies the key, and that's why we're saying let's put people at the heart of this. Let's give people the confidence that they don't have to get on boats.
Can I just put the numbers into perspective? In Indonesia, Australia only in the last 12 months has resettled only 600 people, and there is a waiting list 10,000. So it would take 15 years on those figures to be resettled out of Indonesia. If you look at Malaysia, it would take 75 years to be resettled out of Malaysia. That is precisely why people see no hope in staying in squalid conditions in Malaysia, in squats in Indonesia, all the while not being given the support and safety while they wait. Part of the $70 million, as announced in our policy today, would go towards housing asylum seekers in Indonesia safely and ensuring that their welfare needs are met while they wait for their assessment to be undertaken and for resettlement to occur. At the moment in Indonesia, if you are an Afghan family and you've fled the Pakistan-Afghan border, you've perhaps got to Malaysia, you registered with the UNHCR there, that took 3 or 4 years, you didn't get resettled, it wasn't safe, you move on to Indonesia, and you get to Indonesia, your kids can't go to school, you can't use the local doctor, you can't even go to the hospital, you can't get a job in order to provide for your family. So when a people smuggler comes up and says, if you can scramble together a few $1,000s, I'll get you on a boat to Australia tomorrow, after years of waiting and years of being in fear for your family's safety, that's the only option that seems like a viable one. We have to stop that. We have to stop forcing people into the hands of people smugglers. Give them a safer option and a hope that they will be resettled in a timely manner and safety for them while they wait. It is what has worked in the past, and I think it's worth trying again. And at a time when Australia, the only other options being put on the table is more cruelty, more suffering, the dog whistle politics that goes on in the middle of an election campaign, I think many Australians are crying out for a better way, a humane way, an effective way.
Senator, we had 161 arrivals in 2008 before the previous incarnation of Kevin Rudd dismantled the offshore system. We had about 16,000 last year. How can you equate offshore processing with the increase in arrivals?
Well, let's go back further than 2008. Let's look at what happened in 2002 when the numbers of arrivals dropped from 2000, 2001, 2002. And they really dropped off. There was almost a 50% reduction of refugees seeking protection around the world. We had the fall of the Taliban, and most of the people before then coming to Australia by boat had been from Afghanistan. We saw Australia at that time in 2002 resettle more people directly than we ever had before. 3 key factors that directly led to a decrease in the numbers of people arriving by boat. And then when you fast forward to 2008, we saw the civil war in Sri Lanka, we saw the rise of the Taliban, we saw democracy supporters in Iran starting to be targeted directly. That is the result of the very real risks that people who are in our region looking for our help, asking for safety, terrified the freedom of their families are facing every day at the moment. There has been a massive increase since 2008 to now of the numbers of people in our region needing protection. But at the same time, let me just say, in the last 12 months we've resettled 600 people from Indonesia. That hasn't been enough, but it's also been more than we had in 2008, 2009, 2010 and 2011. The average number of people we were resettling out of Indonesia prior to last year was 70. So you had no other option than to come to Australia by boat.
What will happen to onshore detention under your plan?
onshore detention? Well, look, we've obviously, for those who arrive, whether they arrive by plane or arrive by boat, still need to have their claims assessed. And for those who arrive by boat, and we need to work out who they are, and they have to have their ID checks and their security checks and their assessments lodged. The Greens believe, as does many refugee and human rights organisations, not just in this country but around the world, that there should be a time limit on detention. So onshore detention would still exist, but it would be time managed so that we're not leaving people, refugees, particularly children, locked up indefinitely just because the Department of Immigration hasn't got through their paperwork.
Have you set a time for that?
30 days is what we would prefer. I do, however, acknowledge that it was a promise by Kevin Rudd previously to a 90-day time limit. The government's never abided by that. They've never stuck by it. That would be a good start.
The Greens vote is down below 10% now. What realistically can you hope to get out of this announcement?
Well, I'd respond to that by saying this is about the welfare of refugees. It's about Australia sticking with an international convention, upholding international law. This is about the treatment of people. This election is being fought with the lives of men, women and children who've run away from appalling circumstances and are seeking resettlement. This is not about an election pitch. This is about doing the right thing by refugees, and the Greens' position on this has not changed in decades. The Greens stood up during the Tampa crisis and said, let's put the welfare of people at the heart of this. It was an appalling election strategy of the Howard government at that time. What we're now seeing is the old parties engaged in a race to the bottom, in a race to the polls.
Okay, that's what we're going to leave.